Oh, I'm so excited. This morning, we have a phenomenal speaker, Lorianne. It's so funny to call you that. Cami Jo, Lorianne Wood. And Lori and I have known each other for, a long time, even though we're only in our 20s ourselves. Our kids, her youngest and my oldest, grew up together at the Bentonville Church, and we have lots of fun stories I was reminiscent about. And her son handed down clothes to my son, so we wore lots of Wood clothes. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about Lori this morning. She's an elder's wife at the Bentonville Church of Christ. She is the mother to 3 and the grandmother to 1 beautiful little baby girl. She is also an award-winning author. 7 as of last week, as of last week, she's won 7 awards for her book that you have been so generously given today. And she's also won a few international awards for this book. And you may ask why. Why did she write this book? Well, she's an unlikely writer and found herself in heart failure and kept a blog. And in doing so, that blog turned into a story and a book. And she is spreading the good news with 3 questions, like Amy said, but also a little bit about heart disease in women and what to be looking out for. She wants to get this message out as much as possible and to as many women as possible, both the good news from the good word and the message about heart disease. She's been invited to speak at Pepperdine coming up in 2024, among other locations. I know this is one stop on her mini speaking tour that she's doing. So ladies, will you please help me welcome Lori to the stage?
Thank you. Oh, Cami, I'll keep that. Am I on? Good. I'm going to use that for something else. Oh, you all, it's so good to be here. Cami gave me too generous of an introduction, but apparently she helped potty train one of mine that I'd forgotten about. Oh, it's all good. Well, I'm going to try to control a lot of things at once here, so bear with me if I get behind, or give me a big wink so I know I'm behind. But, as we get through this, you'll start to understand a little bit more about my family and what I've been doing and why I'm up here in the first place. But I'm going to start out and let you know that my small son was a talker. And this was really hard for an introvert mama to have a little talker son. He was nonstop about Pokemon and potty training and Bible characters and canned soup. And what really challenged me, though, were his questions. You might have had, or maybe you were, a child like this. In preschool, I remember him asking me really hard questions about sinkholes and specific diseases and this new thing called the internet. And I specifically remember him I had just come home from the hospital with my 3rd. I had 3 preschool and under at that point. And my 4-year-old son walked into the room and he looked at me and said, "Mom, when are we going to get the World Wide Web?" And I have to tell you, in my postpartum haze, I didn't know what he was talking about. And I was never one to say, I don't know, or to make something up. So when he came up with a hard question, I just changed the subject. I avoided his questions. And then I handed it over to my husband, Dell, when he walked home in the evening. Because questions without answers scared me. You might be able to relate to that. As Cami said, I am Lori Wood. I've been at the Bentonville Church for, I think 32 years now, where my husband is a shepherd. But long before he was a shepherd, he was my high school sweetheart. And I chased him all the way from 9th grade through graduate school at Oklahoma State in Stillwater. And so we now have these 3 grown children. One is that talkative little guy who is now more introverted like his mama. And we've added a son-in-law. We love him. And an even more amazing granddaughter named Hazel. And the only thing I don't like about any of them is that they all live entirely too far away from me. But Hazel has given us a deep appreciation for FaceTime calls and budget airlines, and we use them both all the time. But I want to step back to the beginning, to my beginning. I have known about God almost since I've known about my parents. I don't remember a time ever thinking that I didn't know that God existed. I was raised in a Christian home. We raised our children in a Christian home. We were active members with Bible Hour and youth group and teaching classes. And in fact, we taught adult Bible classes on a summer mission trip for 10 summers in a row. And near the end of that 10 summers, let's see if I can do both of those. There we go. I had a medical evaluation for a life insurance policy. And it was one of those where they were trying to determine if you qualified for preferred life insurance. And I was told in that evaluation, this was in November of 2015, I was told that I had less than 3% chance of ever developing heart disease in my lifetime. And I wasn't very surprised about that because I've always had low blood pressure and low cholesterol. I've always just been a healthy person. I've never been hospitalized at that point outside of childbirth. I had never taken any prescription medication. But then 3 weeks later was Thanksgiving week, and I just wasn't feeling well. But I had kids at home, and I had some coming home from college, and I thought, I got to get my act together because I got a lot of mom things to do this week. So I went to Convenient Care on Sunday before Thanksgiving, and they gave me an inhaler. And then I just couldn't kick it. I was not feeling well throughout that week. By Wednesday, I was getting a little bit worried. I thought, I'm going back to Convenient Care, and maybe I'll get a steroid shot, and I can really kick in and get this Thanksgiving thing wrapped up. And they gave me an antibiotic. And I came home, and basically the next day was Thanksgiving. I basically just stayed in bed all of Thanksgiving. I could hear Thanksgiving going on. I could hear laughter and dishes and all the things. But I didn't have the energy or the stamina or whatever it was to get out of bed, which was really strange for me. Well, the next day was Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. And that's a significant day in our family because on that day, 8 years ago, my high school sweetheart became more of my caregiver. And I'm alive today because he got up early on Friday morning. He called our family doctor, and he insisted that I be seen that morning by that doctor. And I know that because my cardiologist told me as I was sitting on the floor in my bedroom, struggling to put my socks on, I was about to die. We got to my family doctor, and he listened to my heart with a stethoscope. And then he said something that I knew was going to be significant in one way or another. He said, if we're lucky, it's pneumonia. And I remember looking at Dale thinking, I thought that was worst case scenario. So he took us to an x-ray lab, took a chest x-ray, and what he found was an extremely enlarged heart. And he direct admitted me to cardiac ICU in Rogers. From day one, I was diagnosed with end-stage heart failure. And I learned that my heart was functioning at just 6%. And I have to tell you, I had no idea what heart failure even was. I assumed at that point that it was something the same as a heart attack. It was a major shock, needless to say, because something like that was never on my radar. I had no risk factors. I have no family history of heart disease. So if I'd made a list of all the things I'm worried about that might happen someday in my lifetime, I would have had near the top cancer or car accident. but heart disease wouldn't have even made the list. Well, doctors suspect and theorize that a virus attacked my heart. But in a very pre-COVID world, that was a strange idea. And the truth is, we may never know what happened to my heart. But I do know that I had symptoms that I just didn't recognize as heart-related for many, many years. 2 years after I got that diagnosis, I was trained at Mayo Clinic to be a community educator for Women Heart. And they're the ones that supplied the bag and the information inside the bag about heart disease for you today. But I learned when I was there some things that kind of shocked me. Even 2 years into my diagnosis, I learned that heart disease is the #1 killer of men and women worldwide. I learned that it claims more lives than all forms of cancer combined. And maybe most importantly, I learned that the only self-exam for heart disease is awareness. And, specifically, I learned that there is a difference between heart attacks and heart failure. Heart failure is when your heart is damaged in some way, and it can be in a lot of different ways. But somehow your heart is damaged and it can't pump enough blood to your body that it needs. A heart attack is when there's a sudden loss of blood supply to the heart. So there is some overlap. You can have a heart attack and it can damage your heart and cause heart failure. But for me, it's an electrical problem in my heart that's causing my heart failure. Most heart attacks, as you probably know, occur from a plumbing problem in your heart where you have arteries that may be clogged. And we're often really familiar with heart attack symptoms, and we're getting more familiar with heart attack symptoms in women, right? You might have pain in your left arm or your jaw. You might have pressure in your chest or a heaviness. You might have nausea or sweating. And that alerts us that this might be something to do with a heart attack. But we don't often hear about heart failure symptoms that developed slowly over time. So I want to share with you today some of the heart failure warning signs that I missed. And it's quite a long list. I had shortness of breath. I don't think I even knew what shortness of breath was when I was diagnosed. I need 3 hands here. I had a difficulty with inclines, whether that would be a staircase or a small hill or any kind of elevation. I'd be like, whew, that's really kicking me. I cannot keep up. And there's lots of stories there where my family was like, you need to go get checked out. I had an inability to exercise. I had unusual fatigue. I had constant dry cough. I was filling up quickly at meals, and I had unexplained weight gain. And I sometimes had this feeling of my heart pounding outside my chest or racing. And when I looked at those symptoms, I realized I made excuses for all of them because they all kind of don't seem that significant on their own, right? The first 3 or 4, I excused myself because I said, my husband runs marathons. He just finished the Bentonville Half. He's a runner. My kids were playing high school sports. So I knew that I was the one out of shape. I knew I was the one that needed to get back in it and take better care of myself. And as far as the weight gain, my friends were talking about, I can't seem to lose that weight I've gained in middle age. And I thought, there you have it. That's what that is. But the strange thing is, when I was first admitted to the hospital, they drained 14 pounds of fluid from me. And then that constant dry cough. I remember going through these with my kids after my diagnosis. I said, they don't think it's genetic, but they don't know for sure. So I want you to know about all of these warning signs. And there's more than this, but these are the ones I had, although I don't think I had the constant dry cough, but these others I had. And Maggie, my youngest, said, "Mom, you've always had a constant dry cough. When we would lose you in a store like Walmart, that's how we'd find you. We would just wait for you to cough." And I had no idea. Because taken individually, they just seem so insignificant, right? And I was so healthy on so many other fronts. And then there was that life insurance thing, right? Less than 3% chance of ever getting heart disease. So while these were subtle symptoms, they crept up on me for decades. And when I got that diagnosis, it still felt unfair and it felt unexpected. Well, during my initial ICU stay 8 years ago, my daughter's choir, her high school choir, gave me a private concert in the Mercy Chapel because they didn't think I'd be alive in time to see the public one. And that's the picture in the middle. I now know that no one, especially the doctors, expected me to leave ICU. But I obviously did. And when I did, they sent me home with a hospice binder. Optimistic doctors were giving me a 5-year life expectancy, and the more realistic ones were thinking like 6 months. And we got sympathetic tears from just about every medical professional we saw. I was, during that time, flown to Cleveland Clinic, and I became my doctor's most critical patient there for 1.5 years. And she later told me that when she first saw me, my heart was the largest heart she'd ever seen. And that's not something you want to hear from the head of transplant at Cleveland Clinic. You know, during that time, I wore a life vest. I don't know if you know anyone that's worn one of those. It's an external vest that you wear under your clothes, and there's a battery pack that shocks you from outside your body, kind of like one of those ones that you guys probably have here in AED, but it's one you wear, a personal one. And you can see, I don't know if you can see in the picture where I'm with my son at his graduation, that wire down by my leg is me wearing that life vest. And I carried around a card, and I still have it on my desk. It's a little laminated card that says that I'm at high risk of dying suddenly. And I titrated potent medications to their maximum dosages. I was eventually implanted with a special internal pacemaker and defibrillator that's specially made for heart failure patients. And then we waited. And this started a very challenging period in my life, not only health-wise, but in my relationship with God. Because we were doing everything we knew to do physically. I was drastically reducing sodium. I was increasing rest. I was begging the doctors to increase my meds to give me a chance. And we were doing everything we knew to do spiritually. I had been anointed by the shepherds. I had solicited prayers. I still have the framed prayer chain where people were praying for me around the clock, setting a timer on their phone to remind them to pray for me. But we went almost 1.5 years with nothing. I was alive, but I was just barely hanging on. I've always had 2 sets of doctors, a local team at Mercy and a team of doctors at the Cleveland Clinic. And when I would go to Mercy every week and check in with my cardiologist, after a while I remember this feeling like they were almost surprised that I kept coming in, that I was still alive to come in. But one time in particular, my cardiologist patted me on the back on the way out, and he said, "You just keep on living." And then my Cleveland Clinic doctor recently told me that every time in those early months when she got a call from Arkansas, she thought it was to say they'd lost me. And what was going on with me was that I started to close God out. I felt my faith getting weak right alongside my heart. And I feared that my own weakening faith was the reason that other people's prayers weren't being answered on my behalf. I was reluctant to go anywhere. I didn't want to go to the grocery store or Walmart or even to church because I didn't want to have to face people. I didn't want to have to let them down that I wasn't getting better and things weren't happening. And I felt like I was having to cover for God in what seemed like his indifference in my situation. But somehow I clung to the faith of other people and I held on temporarily. Well, one day, whoops, skipped one. Okay, there we go. One day we were driving past our church building in Bentonville, and I don't know if you know, our building is there on North Walton, kind of across from Kentucky Fried Chicken, and this is our activity center building. And this picture is very significant to me for several reasons. Number one, we just happened to be driving by. You can tell the parking lot's empty. We were not there for church service or a wedding or anything like that. We just happened to be driving by Walton when this rainbow popped up. And it's significant to me also because I don't remember ever seeing such a clear, and the actual photograph is just very vivid, the colors, and the beginning and the end of the rainbow, and our church building, our activity center, perfectly framed underneath. But maybe the most significant thing about that picture is I actually talked my husband into pulling over and stopping on the way to somewhere else and taking that picture. And I'm so glad he agreed, because the very next day, I came down with appendicitis, of all things. Well, no one wanted to operate on me with a weak heart that it was. I could die in surgery of heart issues, or I could die without surgery with a bad appendix. So the doctors really had this impossible choice to make. And they decided to do an echocardiogram, which is how they tell usually what your heart function is. And they discovered on that day, which was 16 months to the day when I was diagnosed, they discovered that against all medical odds, somehow my heart function had returned to near normal. And I think I was more surprised then than I was when I got my diagnosis. And I remember being wheeled into surgery to get my appendix out, and all I could think was, I just got my life back. I thought that was the end of my story. I thought my story was one of divine healing and God's prayer and answered prayers and God's provision. And I thought I understood that complete rainbow that we'd seen the day before. And I was prepared to tell that story. And I did tell it for a while and write about it. Local doctors were saying it was a divine healing that they were so glad they got to witness. And Cleveland Clinic was calling me their miracle woman. And I desperately wanted to believe that that was the end of my detour. But then 4 years ago, my heart function dropped, and I found myself in active heart failure again. And I'm learning that heart failure is a chronic, progressive disease. It never goes away, and it only goes in one direction. You might be saying, well, how did you get that near normal reading then? And if you think about a line graph going down, is that the right direction for you? Going down, you can have spikes up even though your overall trajectory is still down. And that's what was happening there. For most people, medical science can help manage the symptoms. And for some, they can slow down the progression, but there is no cure. In the last year, I've received a new internal device, and my heart function has dropped significantly twice. So what I thought was this temporary detour actually turned out to be a completely different life road. And at every turn, I have struggled with questioning God. And I have struggled with the struggle too. I was confused and embarrassed to have such big faith questions after being a believer all my life. You know, I was raised by a mother who knew with every fiber of her being that God was real and active and made a difference in her life. And then I married a man with the same spiritual DNA. And so I found myself at odds with my upbringing and my surroundings because I felt this deep need to question. And so I had to make a risky decision to embrace those questions and my uncertainties and dive headfirst into what felt like at the time contradictions with God. Well, out of that questioning came a book that I wouldn't have taken the time to write in a safer, healthier life. It was released in February of 2023, and the audiobook just came out last fall. And as Cammie said, that's the book that you all have in your bag. And it's a book that's born of my diagnosis and illness, but it's not primarily about the medical events. I do have little snippets of some journal entries in there just to give you a glimpse into what was going on with me. But primarily, it's a guide for other people who end up on a path that they didn't choose either. And I wanted it to be a guide to confront what I think are the three most important questions of any life. These questions, they sort of nag at the back of your mind all your life, but when you get thrown off on a detour of some sort, they demand to be addressed. And I wrote it in 40 essays based on Jesus' time in the desert. And because, you know, when Jesus was in the desert, that had to feel to him like a detour as well. He was ready to begin his public ministry, which was his main route, and yet he first had to go into the desert. Well, his three temptations there inspired the book's three life questions. Because when you think about it, any temptation is just an internal question that you're asking yourself. I want to read just a little bit from the book about these three questions. I was just going to redo it, and I'm like, I already wrote it in the book the best I could, so I might as well just read that. It says, when the enemy tempted Jesus to turn the stones into bread to satisfy his physical hunger, he was whispering something to Jesus that he often whispers to us in our physical suffering. Survival is most important. Do whatever it takes to make sure you are comfortable in this life. Nothing else is guaranteed but what you can see and feel and taste here. Your immediate concerns matter most. And as believers, we are left with the question number one, which is a question of worry. Then Satan tried the second whisper. Bending down to Jesus' ear and to ours, jump and see if God will suspend natural laws to save you. God will catch you if he loves you. He won't let you get hurt. A good God wouldn't let his child suffer. If he does, he must not care. So we struggle with the question of doubt. Is God always good? And finally, Satan asked Jesus to worship him instead of God in exchange for wealth in this life. And the enemy has whispered that lie to many of us. Your plan is at least as good as God's, probably better. Besides, you don't have to be all in with God. You can still run your part of the show. We come face to face with a question of control, especially when we end up in a desert. Is God's plan enough? Well, you know, God has already used this book in so many ways already. I just stand back and kind of watch him go with it. As Cammie said, it's been recognized by some awards, and it even appeared, of all places, on a billboard in Times Square last June. But more precious to me than all of that are the emails and the notes and the comments I get that say that it spoke to someone who had a hurting heart at just the right time. Now, this has been my detour, and I know it's not yours, but I also know I'm not the only one on a detour. I'm not alone. Divorce, disease, disappointment, disaster, we have all been rerouted in some way. Most of us are already on, or we will be on, routes that we didn't choose for ourselves. And we shouldn't really be surprised about that, because in Scripture, a detour is often described as a desert or a wilderness. You know, when I was first in this health and faith desert detour and writing the book, I thought the desert was an unexpected place, an unusual place. But the desert is a familiar scene in the Bible. It's mentioned more than 300 times to represent a desolate, unplanned place. You know, it's where Hagar cried desperate while her infant son was dying of thirst. It's where a fear-filled Elijah prayed for death. And it's where those Israelites embarked on an 11-day trip that turned into 40 years. Even the most significant life in history experienced that major detour into the desert. But the good news is, the desert is more than an unexpected, desolate route. It's also a place where we find God. And there's some Hebrew words that can help us with this idea. The Hebrew word for desert is midbar, and that sounds so much like another Hebrew word, medaber, which is speaking. And in fact, they're actually the same Hebrew word in a way because they don't use vowels. So if you take the vowels out, we're left at the same thing. And even more amazing to me is that the root word of both of those is dibber, which means holy of holies. God speaks in the desert, and he meets us there in the hardest places, just like he did with the Holy of Holies. You know, over the last 8 years, I've been learning, and I'm still learning, about navigating these life detours. And we're going to be exploring more of that today. But, you know, to be fair, I still don't have all the answers to what my little boy was asking or to the ones I've been asking lately about my faith. But I now know I'm not afraid of those questions. I'm learning to use those questions for good. And as far as that rainbow we saw, I've learned that it never meant that it wouldn't rain again. It meant that when it did rain, we wouldn't have to go through it alone. It meant that God will never let a flood consume all of life or all of anyone's life. This detour I'm on is something I never would have chosen, but I've developed a deeper faith than I ever would have imagined. To get there, though, I had to lean into those 3 questions that we're going to be talking about, and I had to get okay with not necessarily having answers to them. Because what I realized was what I needed most, even more than an answer or healing, was just permission to ask the questions. And I am excited for today. We're going to tip our toes into those 3 questions. I'm looking forward to sharing more. And one of the things that was already mentioned is there is going to be some drawings starting the next session. So if you haven't filled out your little piece of paper, and I'm going to show you, try to entice you even more to not only these beautiful baskets at the end, but also I have a Christian women's magazine that has, I got a couple choices for you, has my article in it, and also I think you're going to love it. So I want you to know, if you know Jill Briscoe, who are my people? She's great. She started this magazine. And also I'm going to be drawing we're going to play some games and see who can win. This is a devotional that has one of my devos in it from my publisher, different book. So we've got some great stuff. Go ahead and turn your page in, and we will get to that. I think we're going to take a few minutes for some discussion questions, and I'm going to before Stacy gets up here, I'm going to play a song, and it's going to be the same song all day long. But I'm playing it because I want it to get in your head. It is going to speak to you about what we're talking about today. So if you get a chance, take a screenshot of the name of the song, because you probably haven't heard it, and the name of the artist, and go pull up the lyric video. So good. So that's what that's about.